Hello. Uh, Looking at something here. I've talked about Phil Collins before. I made a video a few months ago that went through all the Phil Collins CDs that I have. And at that time, I didn't have this one. Hello, I Must Be Going. And so I thought I'd make a video and I'd combine it together with his biography, which I've been reading over the last month or so. This is a library book. I don't actually really buy many books nowadays because well, they're expensive, and you can get pretty much everything from the library for free, and so on and so forth. In the previous video, I showed that I have Face Value, No Jacket Required, but seriously, um, going back. Is that all I have? Oh, I've got Both Sides as well, both sides, but I don't have Dance into the Light from '96 or Testify from 2002. I've heard both those. I thought I actually had Testify, but then I went and had a look, and I don't. But I got this. I picked this up a couple of months ago. This is his second solo album. This was put out in 1982, um, and it's okay. I guess if you like Phil Collins, you might like it. So the singles from it, what it says here on there, includes "I Don't Care Anymore," which is probably one of my favorite Phil Collins songs. Full stop. And "You Can't Hurry Love," which is on the opposite end of the spectrum, is perhaps one of my least favorite Phil Collins solo songs. He really goes for the kind of Motown, 60s Motown sound on that. And he's a big fan of Motown. But it comes off as sounding uh, overly derivative, which I think is the point. Uh, like it's very much a homage in a very direct way. But I don't really like it. So what are some of the other good songs on this? I don't like China, track 3. I can't stand that song. Um, I What I do like is track 9, The West Side, which is kind of a what am I trying to say? An instrumental, and it's something a little bit different. There's like a little bit of vocal kind of here, like it's like kind of moaning in the background, I think, in some of his but it's not like a fully sung song. Um, what else? Yeah, there's a lot of horns. I see he's got a specific horn section, the Phoenix horns. Um, Phil Collins is very partial to the horn sections, and again, I think it comes back to his love of R&B, 60s R&B Motown sound. I Can't Believe It's True, is that track 4? Track 2 is really kind of got those typical Phil Collins horns, which I think are a little bit cheesy and overused sometimes. The thing is that with him, with Phil Collins, I know a lot of people hate him, and we talked about that in the other video. But when on his solo stuff, when he goes a bit strange, not strange. I even know how. Like I Don't Care Anymore. Maybe more stripped back. I think he does the stripped back kind of sparse sounds quite well. So the songs I like of his, at least his singles, the songs I like, "In the Air Tonight," "I Don't Care Anymore." I'm trying to. I was actually about to say "Easy Lover," but "Easy Lover" is absolutely not sparse at all. Um, what's that other song I like? The one "Take Me Home." That's kind of sparse-ish. "Take Me Home," but at least let's say, and "I Don't Care Anymore." The reason why I like that kind of song, is basically the drum that he's using, the drum, whatever drum pattern, or his drums in general, are what drive that song through, and then it kind of comes in with synth in and out and a bit of bass and whatnot. But when he tries things that are a little bit different, and maybe I was going to say more on the Genesis side, but it's not necessarily on the more on the Genesis side. I just think when he tries things different, he's better. Whereas when he's just going into like the schlock pop R&B stuff, it gets very cheesy very quickly, and I can only take so much of things like that and like Two Hearts and so on and so forth. But yeah, the album, the CD itself, I picked this up for 50 cents when I got it a few months ago. The condition is okay. This is from 1982. I don't know if this CD was actually put out in 1982. Um, I just heard on the radio as I was leaving the house the other day a kind of a trivial pursuit or a general knowledge question. It was in 1982, the very first CD was released. What was it? And apparently, it's Billy Joel's 52nd Street, which I own. I don't own the 1982 version. I own a reissue of it, but that's kind of interesting, isn't it? But I assume this might have been put out shortly after 1982, maybe. 'Cause it says 1982 down there, but sometimes you'll see the year the album was released, and then it'll have a second date stamp somewhere on it, which is when the CD itself it was issued. But I can only see 82, so maybe this was an 82 issuing as well. Um, no, I can't find that. Anyway, like I don't want to speak out this album specifically because I find his stuff in the 80s much of a muchness, his solo stuff. I like parts of it, but I don't find there's a huge difference going from album to album. And there's tends to be a lot of filler in it, even though they were super successful. This probably sold a few million copies, I assume. It's 7 singles off this. Through these walls, can't hurry love, I don't care anymore, don't let him steal your heart away, I cannot believe it's true, why can't it wait till morning, it don't matter to me. They released those 7 albums as singles. Sorry, those 7 songs as singles. Just see the got number 2 in the UK, number 8 in the US. Oh, here we go. So it's 3 million in the US. Sold a million in Germany alone. Jeez, a million in Britain. So it's got to be, at least 6, 7 million around the world. Um, the reason why I talked about this is because I wanted to kind of lead into talk about the biography. So I've been wanting to read this for a long time. I'd kind of, you know, as you get older, or I don't know, as life happens, you have less time for reading. When I was younger, I used to read a lot in my 20s when I was at university, that kind of age. I guess kind of pre-smartphones as well. Nowadays, I guess you come home and you just kind of sit down and you waste your time looking at your phone. Well, I should be speaking for myself. I sometimes do that. Whereas in the past, I would have done that with a book. Um, but now that when I want to read a book, I've got to think, okay, do I have the time? Am I particularly busy this month or these few weeks? And anyway, for whatever reason, I got this book out, and I've managed to get through 90% of it. I haven't finished it, but I've got very close to finishing it, and it's pretty good. It's interesting. At the same time, it's quite surface level, and it's written. There's different kinds of biographies that musicians put out. There are some that focus more on the music side and go really in depth into kind of how songs were written and studio experiences and kind of band relations and that kind of stuff. And maybe that's what I prefer. Whereas this one, I guess because it's targeted more at a general audience as opposed to music fan, it kind of spends a lot of time on his personal life. And of course, the personal life and the professional intertwine. You can't remove one without, you have to be able to explain them both together because they both affect each other. But he does spend a lot of time talking about kind of the breakdown of his marriages, and that kind of is of an overarching theme through it is that he's seems to have a lot of regret that he's had 3 broken marriages, particularly he feels, I guess, a certain amount of guilt that how that affected his children. At the same time, he's quite glib in the way that he describes. He's got a kind of a cold, and I don't think he's intending to come off this way. And I don't know if it's part of it's to do with his Britishness and kind of the way he describes his father in the early chapters in his childhood. His father kind of sounds very much of that, um, you know, early 20th century World War II generation, or at least they fought in the war. His father's kind of age, who really didn't show their emotions and didn't talk about things, and that was kind of seen as the what do you call it? Not the stereotype. Well, it was a stereotype, but also kind of that was how you should be. That's what a man should be. And Phil Collins was born in 1951, so kind of the baby boomer generation. And it feels like that his father's distant, and I mean emotional distance, affected him, and that kind of rubbed off in the way he approached relationships with his three wives. And that might just be the way he writes about it, and he's not giving it the full account, but he kind of it sounds like he's just like, well, we were having troubles, and then the marriage was over. I did this, and then try as I might, we were divorced. It's kind of how it seems to go. And then towards the later chapters, that's when he kind of goes back more to talking about his kids and how he regrets, like he just wasn't there for enough of the time. And that's not just because the divorce aspect, but also because he's at that time one of the biggest musicians on earth. In the mid to late 80s would be him, Michael Jackson, Madonna, a few others, but he would be up there with them as kind of top of the top of musical artists in the world. There's some good family pictures there of him in his youth growing up in London, or at least on the outskirts of London. Then he gets into the Genesis days, and some quite funny photos. And then kind of getting into the solo period. The part I particularly liked is when he first got into Genesis, his account of that, and his description of the guys in Genesis. And they really came from not necessarily two different worlds, because I don't think there was that big a gap. But in England at that time, class differences were much more pronounced than they are perhaps today. And Peter Gabriel and Tony Banks and Mike Rutherford were public school boys, and public school in Britain means the opposite. It means schools that you pay a lot of money for, and they're very, what do you call? Not everyone can go to. Only the children of quite wealthy families, and they went to Charterhouse School, and so they were, even being from New Zealand, I understand that the connotation of being a public school boy, and they were absolutely public school boys. And Phil Collins wasn't. He was I think he went to a grammar school, much more kind of he wasn't working class, but he also wasn't that kind of upper class that the other guys were. And so kind of that, wouldn't call it a culture clash, but at least kind of the differences that he experienced, and kind of, again, his descriptions of meeting the other guys in Genesis and how they were and how they appeared. That was interesting. And also kind of the progression of that band and how his role in the band changed after Peter Gabriel left. Obviously, he went into the position of basically the front man, and then when Steve Hackett left as well. And then the kind of more mainstream direction that that Genesis were going in the late 70s into the early 80s, which coincided with his first solo album in 81, Face Value. All that kind of stuff. I'm kind of just giving a précis account of his life, but he describes that period quite well. I like the Genesis up to early pre-superstardom era. I find to be quite interesting. Then when we get to the 80s, it kind of takes off a bit, and you can just imagine he was here, there, and everywhere in the 80s, and that's where it all gets like the way he explains it is like, well, it was almost like he was just along for the ride, uh, if you know what I mean. It wasn't like he hadn't like planned all this out, which obviously he hadn't. I don't think he ever anticipated that kind of global superstardom that he achieved. But the way he writes about it, sometimes it sounds like he is being a bit disingenuous. The way that's like, oh, can you believe it? And then this happened, and would you know it? Oh, then I was playing Live Aid in two continents on the same day, and then in saying that, he always seems quite self-aware of that he was disliked by a lot of people by his omnipresence, that he was kind of rubbed people the wrong way after a while, and also quite self-deprecating. This little bald fellow, this little bald drummer, somehow had kind of found his way into the, A-league of music. So he kind of walks that line between, like I said, kind of glibness, but also self-awareness and a few other things at the same time. Um, he he also sounds like by the 90s that he was sick of it, and that he was kind of happy that his solo career was kind of winding down. And when I say winding down, I mean as in terms of album sales and touring and whatnot. What I also didn't know, and this comes kind of later, is that how much he was drinking. Like he was a proper alcoholic. And that kind of like really ravaged his health, along with other things, along with touring and being a drummer, and some old injuries, and the use of steroids to help with vocal cord inflammation, all that kind of stuff coalesced together that really took a toll on his body, which is why we see where he is today, which is basically almost wheelchair bound. Not completely, he can still walk, but he's definitely got mobility issues, and if you've seen any footage of him in the last 5 years, he's performing from a seated position, if he can perform at all, which he may not. He's just finished a tour with Genesis, I think last year, 2022, or maybe it was this year, but he said from the stage that that's it forever. He said that a few times though, hasn't he? But I'd say it's getting beyond his control now, whether it's got to kind of, I don't think they're going to be able to continue performing whether he wants to or not, because of the physical limitations. Kind of skipping over a lot. He got married, his third wife, which is that lady there, Oriane. He kind of really sounded like he wanted to make a go of that. Like after having two failures, he was kind of like resolute and like, I'm going to make this one work. But then again, the way that he describes the breakdown of the marriage sounds like, if you just believe only what's in the book, you'd sound like, well, actually, it sounds like he didn't really care. He was just like, oh, well, hands up in the air. I can't fix this. It's over. But I don't think that's necessarily true. I just think kind of maybe for brevity's sake, or for, not wanting to reveal too much personally, he glosses over some things. What was I saying about that? I was going to say that kind of, his marriage there, his last marriage, kind of coincided with his solo album, so his solo career becoming less and less prominent. He also did that Tarzan project. He wrote the music for Tarzan and Brother Bear, two Disney animated uh, movies, and especially the Tarzan one sounded like it took up a lot of his time. Um, so anyway, we get to the 2000s. It's kind of like he's on a bit of a downward spiral, health wise and relationship wise. His marriage breaks up. She sounds like a bit of a witch, to be honest. Especially if you read the stuff that's happened since, I think, after this book was published. Book came out in 2016. If you read the stuff, so basically, their marriage broke down, divorce about in the 2000s, 2010s, maybe 2000s, late 2000s. I think she got a $46 million settlement. Then she was afflicted with some quite serious illness and was almost paralyzed. And he kind of came back to her and to take care of her with the family all together. And it was kind of like they forgave each other, and they're kind of like there. And then if you read more recently, like during the COVID period, she like got had secretly got married again without telling him, and then like booted him out of the house and had like security come and like remove him from his own house. And he's not in the best of health, and I feel a bit sorry for him because yeah, it does sound like he really wanted to make that last relationship work. There he is there down the bottom with all his kids. So he's got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 kids across 3 marriages. One of them is adopted. The oldest daughter, Jolie, was adopted. He adopted her with his first wife. And there he is there with Oriane, who, like I said, since then, it was 2016. So since then, the relationship has broken down again. And you better to read about it yourself. And then if you Google it in the news, you can read some of the shit about it. But the oldest son there is Nick Collins, who was doing drumming on his most recent solo tour in the late 2010s, I think 2019. And I think also he was drumming. No, was he drumming in Genesis? Maybe not drumming in Genesis, but he was certainly on tour with his dad, which I think is a cool thing, a really nice thing. I don't know. There's a lot else I could say about this because it's a long book. It's like 300 some pages, and he covers a lot of stuff. And like I said, it's interesting, but I don't know. I'm forgetting a lot, and this is already 22 minutes, so I don't want to go too far into it. Yeah. So overall, and I guess this is true. Whenever I kind of read something, it kind of makes you reappreciate the music. Go back, and I have listened to a lot of Phil Collins and Genesis, especially after reading this. And it kind of, I really like doing that, reading a book or listening to kind of a podcast of a musician, and then kind of hearing them talk about the music, and you're going to kind of get a new understanding of it, a new appreciation, going back and listening to it and kind of seeing it in a new light, or just, I guess discovering new songs that you didn't really ever give much of a chance to before. I think I've said in one of the videos I did about Genesis how I never really liked Invisible Touch, the album. I thought it just sounded sometimes too much like another Phil Collins solo album. But then in hindsight, I was listening to that a lot recently. It's actually a pretty brilliant album. There isn't really a bad song on it. I know some people don't like the song, the single Invisible Touch, but I don't know. It just, like I said, it made me reappreciate it. And that song, Into Deep, I don't know if I talked about that before on another video. I feel like I don't know what I've talked about and what I haven't, because I've talked about so much stuff. But if you told me 10 years ago, what do you think of that song? I just think, oh, it's cheesy, awful rubbish. But having listened to it with, I don't know, with age or something, I don't know, it like affects me in a different way. And I just think it's like a really beautiful song. I appreciate it in a way that I never ever did before. But anyway, so if you have any kind of interest in Phil Collins or Genesis, and I'm sure there are actually probably better Genesis biographies out there. I actually think I've seen some around. That if you want to focus more on that part, might be better to read. But just from his point of view, he sounds like quite an easygoing guy with a good sense of humor, but with a certain coldness to him. And I think those two kind of things seem like polar opposites. Like he seems like kind of like I said, easygoing, nice guy, but at the same time, yeah, I don't know how else to explain it other than coldness. Maybe there's a better way. Emotionally distant, emotionally cold. And maybe that in some way hampered his private life. Anyway, good book. We'll leave it there. Thank you for watching.